He was already dying when they drove the nails in. The man on the cross had been stripped, beaten, and marched through the streets of Jerusalem under the weight of his own execution beam. By the time the soldiers raised him up, the crowd that had cheered him days earlier had scattered or turned. What remained was a small group of women, a handful of followers, and the indifferent machinery of Roman justice. The year was likely around 30 in the Common Era. The place a hill just outside the city walls. The charge, a threat the authorities could not ignore. But what happened in the days that followed would not stay on that hill. It would fracture time itself. To understand why this death was different, you have to go back. Jesus of Nazareth had emerged in the region of Galilee as a teacher and healer. The sources we have, the Gospels, written within decades of the events, and references in non-Christian writers like Josephus and Tacitus agree on the outline. He attracted large crowds. He spoke of a kingdom not of this world. He challenged religious and social norms. He was seen by some as a prophet, by others as a danger. By the time he entered Jerusalem, tension was already high. The city was packed with pilgrims for Passover. Any spark could ignite unrest. The Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, was responsible for keeping order. The local religious leadership had their own reasons to want Jesus removed. The stage was set. What happened next was not an accident. In the days that followed, he taught in the temple courts and drew both devotion and fury. The sources record confrontations with religious leaders, warnings about what lay ahead, and a growing sense that a crisis was coming. His closest followers did not yet grasp how soon it would arrive. On the night before his death, the sources say Jesus shared a final meal with his closest followers. He spoke of betrayal, of sacrifice, of a new covenant. One of the 12 would hand him over. Before the night ended, he was arrested in a garden outside the city. The arrest was quiet. No army, no riot. Just the authority of the temple and the compliance of a kiss. He was taken first to the high priest. The accounts describe a night of questioning, mockery, and denial, including by his own disciples. One of them, we are told, denied 3 times that he even knew the man. Before the rooster crowed, the bonds of loyalty had already begun to break. By morning, the religious council had reached a conclusion. They needed Roman approval to execute, so they sent him to Pilate. At the time, no one could have known how far the consequences would reach. The Roman governor was not easily moved. Historians have long debated the exact dynamics between Pilate and the local elite. The Gospels depict him questioning Jesus, finding no clear crime, and even offering to release him. But the crowd, stirred by the authorities, demanded crucifixion. Pilate's priority was order. One man's life was a small price. He washed his hands of the matter. Jesus was scourged, a brutal flogging that left many dead before they ever reached the cross, then handed over to the soldiers. They dressed him in a mock robe, pressed a crown of thorns onto his head, and led him out to be killed. He would have carried the crossbeam through the streets past the same gates he had entered to acclaim. Now the crowd was different. Some wept. Many watched in silence. The soldiers had their orders. The crucifixion itself was public, slow, and designed to terrify. Nails through the wrists and feet. A sign above his head, King of the Jews. Crucifixion was reserved for the lowest offenders, slaves, rebels. Those Rome wanted to make an example of. The message was clear. This is what happens to anyone who challenges the order of things. The hours passed. The sun climbed and then began to fall. The sky, some accounts say, went dark. And then, in the middle of the afternoon, he died. A soldier, we are told, thrust a spear into his side to confirm it. There was no doubt. The body was real. The death was real. For Rome, the case was closed. For the men and women who had followed him, the world had just collapsed. But the story was not finished. Something was coming that would turn everything upside down. But that wasn't the end. A man named Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the council, the sources say, asked Pilate for the body. Normally, the crucified were left to decay or thrown into common graves. That a respected figure would claim this body was itself a risk. Permission was granted. Jesus was taken down, wrapped in linen, and placed in a tomb cut into rock. A large stone was rolled across the entrance. Guards were posted. The Sabbath was approaching. No work could be done. The body lay in the dark, and the city settled into the quiet of a holy day. The story for the authorities was over. For the followers who had fled or watched from a distance, it was the end of everything they had hoped for. They had no plan for what came next. No script, no strategy. Only grief. They did not know that the most shocking turn was still ahead. What happened next changed everything. On the first day of the week, women who had followed Jesus went to the tomb to complete the burial customs. They had watched him die. They had seen where he was laid. They came expecting a body. They found the stone moved and the tomb empty. The body was gone. The accounts differ in detail: how many women, how many figures at the tomb, who ran to tell whom, but they agree on the core. The tomb was empty, and the news was met with disbelief. The disciples did not expect resurrection. When they were told, they did not believe. They had to see for themselves. What they found would force them to risk everything. The tomb was empty. The linens were there. The body was not. The sources do not agree on every witness or every word spoken at that moment. But they agree on this. Something had happened that no one had planned for. The same followers who had hidden in fear would soon step into the open. The same movement that had seemed finished would ignite. And then they began to report something that no one had anticipated. They said he was alive. They said they had seen him not as a ghost, but as a presence they could touch and share food with. He appeared to individuals. He appeared to groups. He appeared, we are told, to more than 500 at once. The resurrection accounts are the most contested part of the story. Historians agree that something happened, that the followers were utterly convinced, that they risked and often lost their lives for this belief, that the movement did not die with the man on the cross but exploded outward. How to explain that conviction is where the paths divide. For believers, the resurrection is the center of faith. For others, it remains a puzzle, but the impact is not in doubt. The man who had been executed as a criminal became, for millions, the one who had overcome death. The cross, an instrument of terror, became a symbol of hope. The story did not stay in Jerusalem. Within years, it had reached the major cities of the empire. The same Tacitus who recorded the reign of Nero would later write of Christians and of Christ, executed under Pilate. The movement faced persecution, internal conflict, and the collapse of empires. It did not disappear. It shaped art, law, ethics, and the calendar by which much of the world still marks time. Early Christian writings, including the letters of Paul written within decades of the events, assume the crucifixion and the resurrection as the foundation of the message. Paul had been a persecutor of the movement before he became its most tireless messenger. He wrote that he had met the risen Christ. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century, confirmed that Christ had suffered the extreme penalty under Pontius Pilate. The Jewish historian Josephus referred to Jesus and to his execution. The man was real. The death was real. The claim that he had risen would divide historians and theologians for 2,000 years. But the impact of that claim would reshape empires. The death and resurrection of Jesus, whether read as history, theology, or both, remain among the most consequential events ever recorded. The hill outside Jerusalem would become the most famous execution ground in history. The empty tomb would be debated, guarded, and venerated. The men and women who had followed him would carry the story to the ends of the known world. They would die for it. They would build empires on it. 2,000 years later, the death and resurrection of Jesus still stand at the center of the largest tradition the world has ever known. Historians may disagree on what exactly happened in the small hours of that first day of the week. They cannot disagree that the world was never the same. The Gospels were written within living memory of the events. They do not always agree on every detail, but on the central facts: the arrest, the trial, the crucifixion, the burial, and the empty tomb, they stand together. Something happened. The rest is history. Across the empire, small communities began to meet, to break bread, and to tell the story. They faced arrest, execution, and the threat of the arena. They did not stop. Within 3 centuries, the faith that had begun with a handful of witnesses in Jerusalem would be recognized by the very power that had crucified its founder. The calendar would be split between before and after. The cross would hang in palaces and in prisons. And the man who had been nailed to a beam outside the city walls would be named in creeds that spanned continents. None of that was visible from the hill that day. All of it began there. The resurrection, as an event, sits just beyond the reach of archaeology and documentary proof. What is not in doubt is the conviction of those who were there, the speed with which the message spread, and the cost they were willing to pay. That combination has left a mark on history that has outlasted every empire that tried to erase it. If this journey through the evidence and the narrative left you curious, like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into history's turning points. We began with a man on a cross. The sources are clear that his followers staked everything on the claim that he had risen. They wrote it down. They preached it in the face of torture and death. They built a movement that would outlive Rome itself. The resurrection, as an event in time, sits at the edge of what history can prove. But the aftermath, the empty tomb, the transformed disciples, the birth of a faith that changed the world, is part of the record. The man who was crucified outside Jerusalem in the early 30s of the 1st century did not fade into legend. He became for billions the hinge of history, and that is a fact no critic of the sources can erase. If you want more stories, like the video and subscribe for new documentaries.